From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. Here's what's coming up. K-State's Gregg Hanzlicek will go over the importance of controlling lice in cow-calf herds during the fall and winter. Gregg will talk about why timeliness and thoroughness of treatment are critical to achieving lice control. Following then, K-State's Jaymelynn Farney. She'll offer several ideas for you cow-calf producers who will be contending with a forage shortage this fall and winter because of the dry hay-growing season. She'll talk about, among other things, limit feeding hay to extend that forage as long as one can. And on this week's horticulture segment, K-State's Dennis Patton talks about when it is and isn't advisable to prune landscape ornamentals here in the fall. All that and more next on Agriculture Today.
A social distancing tip.
Putting distance between yourself and others is critical to slowing the spread of coronavirus. So here are ways to stay in contact without the physical contact part. Call, send a text, set up a video conference, post on social media, dedicate a song on the radio. If you have symptoms of fever, dry cough, and shortness of breath, call your healthcare provider before going to their office. For more info, visit coronavirus.gov.
Let's all do our part, because we're all #alone together. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and our thanks to you for being along with us once more. For you first, another topic under the heading of bovine health management. We routinely invite by to get into such. Gregg Hanzlicek. Gregg is the director of the Production Animal Field Investigations Unit at K-State's Veterinary Diagnostic Laboratory. And what we've asked him to do today is to give us the latest advice on contending with one of the most prominent external parasite problems that you cattle producers encounter at this time of the year and over the next few months. And Gregg, that would be lice infestations. And as it turns out, they're no minor consideration when it comes to cattle parasite control.
Absolutely. As we move from summer into fall and winter, we're getting away from talking about controlling flies, and now we have to talk about lice because the peak time is coming up. And there's some really good research that has indicated that even though we may not notice it, that lice in especially weaned calves, a recent study out of Nebraska showed that calves that were not deloused, their average daily gain was almost a quarter of a pound less per day than those that actually were deloused when they entered the feeding program. And then there's some other studies that have actually put a total dollar amount on the economic impact of lice in cow-calf operations in the U.S., and their estimate is about $126 million a year losses in milk production, weaning weights, destruction of property because they're scratching, those kind of things. So lice is an important topic to talk about.
Those numbers can't be ignored. And moreover, every herd, you say, has lice to some extent or the other.
Absolutely. It's just like flies. Every herd has lice. We can't ever clean up a herd to the point where we don't have any lice. The best thing we can do is just realize we have it. We got to think about when the peak time of the year is, and then put in management programs to minimize the population of the lice.
And why is fall into the winter the peak time for lice activity in herds?
Well, we think there's several reasons. One is that we don't think that lice really like the heat. Some people even think UV light. They don't really like UV light. So that's why in the summertime we don't see lice outbreaks. In the wintertime, as the winter hair coat grows on cows, those lice are insulated from the extreme cold. So even in the upper part of the United States into Canada, they have lice problems also. And then the other reason is that, like I said, every herd has lice. Not every animal in the herd may have lice at any one particular time, but we'll have carrier animals. And so when we bring our herd in for calving or processing or whatever it is in the fall and winter, then those carriers have the opportunity as they rub up against other animals to transmit those lice from animal to animal.
And that is why comprehensive herd treatment is important, which we'll get to. Two types of lice are the most troublesome out there, you say?
Absolutely. We've got two types, and it's important that we understand that. And one, people will call chewing, some people call it biting lice, but these are lice that do not burrow into the skin. They live on the dead skin cells, some hairs, debris that's on the skin. And then we have another class that are what are called the sucking lice, and they actually burrow their head in like a tick into the skin, and they're blood feeders. So there's two different types, and when we talk about managing, it's important that we realize we have to manage for both types.
Since the sucking louse, would be a blood feeder, does it carry disease? Is that part of the concern here?
We don't think that they actually are involved with the bloodborne diseases that we talk a lot about on the cow-calf side, anaplasmosis and bovine leukosis. We don't think that they are carriers because they're not actually hopping from animal to animal. We can have those lice spread from animal to animal as they touch each other, but during their life cycle, they're going to spend their entire life cycle on the same animal unless they're rubbed up against. So they're not moving from animal to animal to transmit the disease.
But what becomes costly is the animal discomfort, that itching. That is the foremost sign of a lice problem.
Absolutely. Whether they're biting on the skin and eating the dead skin cells or whether they're burrowing into the skin, they cause a lot of irritation. And so classical signs are animals that are just scratching constantly. And then eventually, because they're scratching enough, they'll start losing their hair, typically the neck and the shoulders. As far as the sucking lice, we've seen many cases where the animals have so many lice that they become anemic.
Well, then, about delousing a herd and the timing. Is this the point at which one should apply some sort of control product?
Well, it's early, and the peak season is going to be somewhere from November to about March. About March, the populations are going to start going away. But if we try to control our herds, the lice in our herds today, by the time those lice start liking the environment and start reproducing, our products are going to probably be gone. So we talk about fall to winter delousing. It's probably better to wait as long as you can into the winter time than it is to do it too early.
But not to wait to the point where you start to ring up costs in performance and otherwise.
Absolutely. If you're starting to see a lice outbreak, then you're probably behind the 8 ball, and you probably waited 2 to 3 weeks, probably too late.
So looking ahead, and it won't be all that long ahead until one would want to enact their control. Gregg, some particulars here, and back to something you said earlier about animals that can spread lice within a herd. You have to treat each and every animal appropriately to get that full control.
Absolutely. This is I always want to talk to students and the other things is that, sometimes when we're processing calves or cows and we're vaccinating them, and if you ever see me run the chute, I miss my fair share. But if one of those animals gets out of the pen, it's probably not that big deal that we didn't get a vaccine into that one animal. But if we have one animal slip through the chute where we did not delouse them and they happen to be the carrier or they happen to have lice, by the time our products that we've poured everybody else with, their effectiveness have gone away, this animal can actually start a new lice outbreak. So it's very, very, very important that every single animal is part of this prevention program. That
in mind, then, things such as product selection. Where does one start? Or does it matter?
It does matter, and of course, we're always going to say go to use your local veterinarian for advice on what products to use. But there are several products out there. Some of them are the injectable avermectins, the Ivermec and the Dectomax, and those particular products, which will also take care of some of the internal parasites. But the thing about injectable products for the producers to remember is that these products will only have an effect against those lice that are the sucking lice, because they're going to have to take a blood meal in order to be exposed to the insecticide. So it's important that if a producer's using the injectables, that they use another product for lice control by itself. And there are multiple porons on the market. Some of them, they're labeled for just killing the adults and the young lice. And it's important that producers read the label, because some say, well, you pour them today, you need to re-pour in 14 days because you're not taking care of the eggs. The eggs are going to hatch and we're going to have youngsters. Some say just pour as needed, re-pour as needed. There are some newer products that are labeled for a one-time dosage only. And then some really new products are out there where it's a combination of the insecticide and then they have an insect growth regulator in the product. So not only are they controlling the adults and the nymphs, but their youngsters are taking care of the eggs also. So I would use your veterinarian's advice on what product they know are effective in their herds and use those products.
Then aligned with that application technique, is that important to effective control?
Well, it is, and we have complaints every year, or hear complaints forever about, our lice products are not very effective. And number one, the thing to remember is that no one, to my knowledge, has shown that we have any resistance in lice to our insecticides like we do with flies and other things. So that's not part of the problem. But there are multiple reasons why sometimes our products seem like they're not very effective.
One of those could be simply not full application across, in the case of a puron, the back of an animal, you say.
Absolutely. So these products that we use as a puron, they're going to have to migrate across the skin so that they're covering enough area that the lice that are there are going to be killed. And so they're labeled for pouring on the top line all the way from the pole back as far as the product will go. So it's important that we do that. We don't just put it in one area right over the shoulders, those kind of things. Another part of the procedure is dosage. These products are all labeled for so many mLs or cc's per pound of body weight. If we set the gun on the average body weight of the herd, those that weigh more than that, we're going to underdose. And so we're not going to have effective lice control on those animals. So they're going to have the opportunity to spread it to the ones that we did have good control. So it may appear that they're not as effective as they should be.
Well, it is by all means the primary external parasite which would afflict our cattle herds out there as we get into the fall and then very soon the winter. Lice. Producers, consult your veterinarian. Get a game plan together on contending with those. Gregg, thanks for the word right here, as always.
Thank you.
Gregg Hanzlicek, Director of the Production Animal Field Investigations Unit at K-State's Veterinary Diagnostic Laboratory. He's along with us regularly to talk timely matters of bovine health management here on Agriculture Today.
For information on threatening weather, you should depend on the National Weather Service and their broadcast on NOAA Weather Radio. NOAA Weather Radio is an all-hazards radio network that provides up-to-the-minute weather information, including life-saving warnings anytime, day or night. NOAA Weather Radio also broadcasts information on man-made disasters, such as chemical spills, amber alerts, or other national emergencies. For the National Weather Service, I'm Bill Curtis.
Agriculture Today continues now. For too many places around Kansas, this has been a substandard year for hay production, and that has more than a few of you cow-calf producers wondering about making what harvested forage is available stretch through the winter until that spring green-up. Well, on one of her recent Dr. J's Beef podcasts, K-State Beef Systems Specialist Jaymelynn Farney offered up some research-based options worthy of consideration there, and Jaymelynn passes along some of those right here.
Through most of Kansas, we've had some pretty dry conditions beginning about the middle of the summer that has led to some areas of tremendous overgrazing or some areas where we just don't have any forage to make it through the winter. So as such, I'm going to bring up a couple of different options that one might look at trying to stretch your hay supply, because unfortunately, if you don't have any grass out there to graze, you're going to have to feed your cattle hay for a longer period of time or sell them due to drought, which that's something that I've been seeing quite a bit of that coming across different sell markets. So the first thing I really want to kind of address is talking about substitution. And that is one thing that we really don't do as much for our cow-calf operation as we do for a feedlot. But it is where we can provide an equal amount of energy or protein to an animal with a feed that isn't traditionally offered in our system, just because we always want to feed the most hay or most forage to our animals. Typically, corn is considered evil to feed to a cow-calf operation, as you have some negative associative effects in the rumen, where that high starch content actually kills or damages those fibrolytic or the bacteria or the rumen microbial population that digest the fiber in the animal's diet. As such, they eat less overall fiber and less forage. Traditionally, when your hay or your grass is your cheapest component of your ration, you really don't want to reduce the amount of hay or forage is consumed, so we don't really like that substitution effect. However, if you are lacking in forage or you just want to extend the amount of forage you have, utilizing some of that appropriate starch in your diet could help do that. So there's some specific data out there that showed that if you feed corn, for example, that's our most readily available high starch feed, at 0.3% of body weight, so on a 1,000-pound cow, that's about 3 pounds of corn, you really don't lead to that negative associative effect in the rumen, so you don't have a substitution effect. However, in some Oklahoma state data, if you feed a corn-based supplement at 0.7 to 1% of body weight, for each 1 pound of that supplement that you fed to the cattle, they ate 1 pound less forage. So that's one way to possibly be able to increase the number of days that you can use on your forage. In that Oklahoma study, they actually were able to increase stocking rate by 33% by feeding that 1% of body weight of a corn-based supplement. Now, I'm really talking about a pure starchy type feed. And traditionally, we really feed digestible fiber sources such as soybean hulls, wheat midds, corn gluten feed. Those won't give you the same substitution effect as just feeding things like corn, milo, wheat, barley. So you just have to determine whether you want to reduce forage intake or maintain it at what the cattle will do.
Or the producer could simply choose to limit feed the forage itself to extend that resource as far as it can go feasibly.
Now, another option to be able to possibly stretch your hay supply is strictly limit feeding the animals. I had already had on this podcast Dr. Carla Jenkins from the University of Nebraska who talked about confinement cow feeding. And in that, oftentimes those mixed rations or a TMR that consisted of like silage and straw and wet distillers, those really can be fed at only about 1.7 or even down to 1.5% of body weight in some of her data that she has shown. Now, why am I so impressed with that number? Well, traditionally, a lactating cow, she can eat anywhere up to 2.2% of her body weight on a dry matter basis. So we are severely restricting the amount of feed that animal has. But if you're feeding a higher energy, higher digestible feed stuff, those cows don't necessarily need to eat until they get the physical fill component to them. In that Nebraska data, they were able to feed things like 30% wet distillers grain and wheat straw ration with some limestone, and at only 1.7% of body weight, which on these cows, that was 18.3 pounds of dry matter. When you put that back into as fed, we're looking at more like 25 to 28 pounds of dry matter. So that's not very much feed. If you haven't actually measured how many actual pounds of forage your cattle are consuming, don't be surprised if there's about 35 to 40 pounds of hay disappearing a day, depending on the size of your cow. Now, when you are doing something like those TMRs and putting your cattle in a feedlot, or in a confined pen, I should say, those cows aren't walking near as much as they traditionally would, and as such, they don't have as high of energy demands as what we typically look at for our recommendations. So reducing that intake is very easy to do to be able to maintain condition pregnancy rates for your cow-calf pair. Now, when you think about the pairs, though, in that confinement situation, don't forget that the older that calf gets, the more it's going to consume diet as well. So you need to make sure you account for its potential intake of forage.
Another idea Jaymelynn proposes is a pretty simple concept, changing how one utilizes what forage is actually available. That's tied into the limit feeding approach.
Now, another way that you possibly can increase the amount of hay feeding days or be able to extend the amount of hay usage could just be straight out limit feeding of your hay. This has been researched in Illinois to a higher degree, where they actually looked at the amount of hay intake, whether they let the cows have a 24-hour access to hay, 14-hour access to hay, or 6-hour access to hay. And when they looked at that, they found that those cows that only had 6 hours of access versus 24 hours ate 6 pounds of dry matter per head per day less than in that 24-hour period. Now, the other component that was really interesting from that research was that they found that the amount of hay that was wasted was reduced 7-fold. That's another component. We always think about, okay, we can limit the amount of hay into the animal, but if you limit the amount of hay that's just being wasted, that in turn allows you to have more days of hay feeding and be able to be more efficient with your utilization. That research out of Illinois has been repeated a couple of different times, and they find very similar responses. The 6-hour versus 24-hour access to hay in feeders, hay intake is reduced 22% with the 6-hour versus the 24-hour, hay wastage reduced by 45%, and cow body weight change. The cows that have more access to hay do gain a little more weight than those on the 6-hour. However, the ones on the 6-hour still gained weight while lactating, so you still had a positive benefit, and sometimes it kept your cows in the more economic body condition of about that 5.5. Now, this limit feeding or limit access of hay isn't necessarily the do-all, fit-all for every operation. You really need to make sure that you're using a higher quality feed. Do not feed straw or corn stalks. That will not work because you still need to meet energy and protein demands for that animal. It doesn't seem to work maybe quite as well for your first calf heifers or your thin older cows. If you're looking at your mature cows who are in appropriate body condition, have a high quality hay stuff, this is a really good option to help you with your reducing the amount of hay wastage and the amount of intake by your cows.
Those are just some proposals for dealing with short forage supplies that you cow-calf producers might think about. K-State's Jaymelynn Farney has much more on this subject, so we'd invite you to take in her entire podcast for that. Go online and search for Dr. J's Beef. This edition was posted just this past week, so look for it at Dr. J's Beef. There's also a link to it on Jaymelynn's webpage at southeast.ksu.edu. You are tuned in to Agriculture Today. We'll step aside now for a few moments, and when we come back, today's agricultural news headlines, this week's edition of the Kansas Soybean Update with Gregg Hanzlicek, and again, this week's K-State Horticulture feature. All that still ahead here on the K-State Radio Network.
Kansas farmers and ranchers are helping feed your family in the world. The largest contributor to the Kansas economy is beef cattle. How do you get that juicy steak on your plate? In order for you to enjoy your tasty meal, it requires the hard work of the producers, marketers, advertisers, processors, inspectors, transporters, packers, and consumers. So thank all these people and sit back, relax, and enjoy your tasty meal.
You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, coming to you from the campus of Kansas State University. Eric Atkinson with you, and for you now, today's agricultural news headlines, courtesy in part of DTN. An update On the USDA's Coronavirus Food Assistance Program payments, those payments under CFAP 1 have now totaled $10.2 billion, including $5 billion for livestock, $2.6 billion for non-specialty crops, $1.8 billion for dairy, and $769 million for specialty crops. As for CFAP 2 now, the USDA said that payments as of 2 days ago totaled $4.5 billion, including $2.4 billion in acreage-based payments, $1.3 billion for livestock, $452 million for dairy, $376 million for sales commodities, and $109 million for eggs and broilers. Now, by commodity, $1.4 billion has gone for corn, that's 21% of the total, $1 billion for cattle, and $534 million for soybeans. On a state level, $449 million have been paid out in Iowa, $352 million in Illinois, $347 million in Nebraska, $343 million in Minnesota, and $277 million in Wisconsin. Those are the top 5 states in CFAP 2 payments to date. Meantime, sign up for the Agricultural Risk Coverage, or ARC, and Price Loss Coverage, or PLC, programs for the 2021 crop year started this past Tuesday, according to the Farm Service Agency. Sign up for this program will end March the 15th on both counts. Options include electing coverage and enrolling in crop-by-crop ARC, county, or PLC, or the ARC individual for the entire farm. Election changes for 21 are optional. For the 2022 and 2023 crop years, producers will be able to make a new election during those sign-ups. Now, while enrollment started for the 2021 ARC PLC programs, the USDA has begun processing those payments under ARC County and PLC on covered commodities that triggered payments for 2019 crops. Those payments total $5 billion. Under PLC, payments were triggered for corn, grain, sorghum, and wheat. Soybeans did not trigger payments for the 2019 crop year. The owner of the world's largest meat packer pleaded guilty in U.S. federal court yesterday to paying nearly $150 million in bribes to top Brazilian officials, that in exchange for state-backed financing used to invest in beef processing and other things here in the U.S. J&F Investimentos, the controlling shareholder of JBS SA, pleaded guilty in federal court in Brooklyn to one count of conspiring to violate the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. As part of the settlement agreement with the U.S. Department of Justice, it must pay fines of $256 million, half of which will be discounted from hefty penalties it's already paid to Brazilian authorities for the previously disclosed bribe payments. Now, some of the proceeds from the financing deals were used to fund JBS's expansion in the U.S., where in a span of a few years, starting back in 2007, it acquired major competitors, including Swift & Company and Pilgrim's Pride. Separately, yesterday, Pilgrim's Pride, one of the largest poultry producers in the U.S., said it would pay $110.5 million to settle the federal charges that it helped fix prices for chickens and then passed on the higher costs to customers. And U.S. Representative Dusty Johnson of South Dakota and a group of bipartisan co-sponsors have introduced the Price Reform in Cattle Economics Act. It seeks to improve the marketing environment for cattle producers. According to Johnson, the Price Act, for short, combines several new ideas with existing bipartisan proposals to create legislation that would eliminate regulatory barriers, improve market signals, and support small meat processors. Included in this bill, existing legislative proposals to open new markets for state-inspected beef products, such as the Direct Interstate Retail Exemption for Certain Transactions Act, as it's called. Also, new provisions to aid producer-owned beef processing facilities. The legislation would give a directive to the USDA to provide Congress cost benefit and feasibility of various proposals to enhance price discovery through mandatory price reporting, and it seeks to increase transparency in fed cattle transactions. Next up for you, this week's edition of the Kansas Soybean Update. Here's Greg Akagi. Greg?
Philip Lobo, Director of Feed Utilization with Smith Buckland in United Soybean Board. And Philip, a lot of research has been done concerning soy meal usage. It is very good news on some of the things that have been found out.
We're a national organization, but we've funded some really good research right there in Kansas at K-State with Bob Goodband and Mike Tokach, and on soybean meal in growth performance in pigs. And we're seeing some really great results. On one of those trials, they've taken a look at pigs that are between 11 and 25 kilograms, roughly 22 and 50 pounds, and seen that if you increase the soybean meal in those diets, you're going to get a consistent, improved feed to gain and caloric efficiency across the experiments. And they did 4 experiments in there. So it was really encouraging to see. In another trial, they did a look at a new energy system called productive energy. And basically, we're kind of testing to see what's soybean meal's energy really when you're feeding them to pigs on a practical basis, because there are some energy systems that say, well, soybean meal isn't, it's only worth 80% of corn. Well, their trial took a look at increasing levels of soybean meal and found it improved gain to feed and caloric efficiency, and ended up estimating soybean meal's feeding value as somewhere between 105% and 125% of corn, which is a lot greater than the estimates from the National Research Council. The idea here is to, help pig farmers get more value out of their feed and help that nutritionist that works with them get more value out of that feed. And, when soybean meal's 15% to 20% of the feed, if you can get a little extra value out of it, it ends up adding up to a fair bit of money in the long run.
And as a great protein source for pigs.
The nice thing about soybean meal is it's an all-natural product that has a little bit of variation, but it's also very complex too. So you've got energy in there, you've got amino acids in there, which are the key thing, and you've got other things like isoflavones and some oligosaccharide fibers that can offer some health benefits too.
That is Philip Lobo, who is Director of Feed Utilization with Smith Buckland and United Soybean Board, and he joins us on the Kansas Soybean Update. It's brought to you by the Kansas Soybean Commission.
Thanks, Greg, and this is Agriculture Today.
Social distancing slows the spread of coronavirus, so stay a minimum of 6 feet away from others and stay home if you can. More info at coronavirus.gov. Let's all do our part, because we're all #alone together. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
For you now on this Agriculture Today, it's our weekly horticulture segment, and joining us is Dennis Patton. Dennis is the Johnson County Extension Horticulture Agent. As we get into, Dennis, the prospect of pruning landscape ornamentals in the fall. And you tell us right out that one doesn't want to get too carried away with trimming those trees or shrubs back. You might speak to that.
That's right. We find we get a lot of people calling our office here with the season winding down, wanting to prune this and that. And our response is, let's take a look at that. Maybe let's put a break on it a little bit and not prune exactly this early. Our plants are not dormant yet. We've not had a hard freeze in much of Kansas yet. The plants are still actively growing. They're still pulling the energy, the nutrients down into the root systems to survive for the next year. And so we want to make sure we don't really do any pruning cuts until that plant is fully dormant. But with that being said, there's always some nips and tucks you can take here and there to help improve the plant material and get a jump on next year.
So the first point is to wait until the plant is dormant. Does that mean immediately after that first hard freeze? How can one be sure?
That's a great question. It's going to vary across the state of Kansas, but one good indicator is until all the foliage has dropped from the plant. Another time people will say, well, let's wait till we get 2 or 3 good hard freezes, and that would be 28 degrees or lower. Some people say, well, maybe depending on the typical Kansas weather and the part of the state you're in, that would happen somewhere between maybe Thanksgiving and Christmas. You could start getting a jump on pruning. Definitely once we get after the first of the year, you're pretty much free to prune. The ideal time to do a lot of pruning, people say, is maybe late February, early March, because that's just before those plant materials are ready to put on that spring flush of growth. So all that energy goes in developing that new growth and healing over or sealing over the wound created by pruning. And that's the problem with pruning in the fall. That wound doesn't have a chance to properly seal over, and you could get a little bit of winter injury depending on the severity of the winter at that pruning junction.
That's not to say that one should totally abandon the idea of pruning in the fall for certain species.
Yeah, we always have, in our Extension Master Gardener lingo, we always use the term DDD, dead, dying, or diseased. Any of that type of wood has absolutely no value to the plant. If it's dead, it's not transporting any nutrients into the plant. If it's diseased, it's going to be a hazard potentially next year. If it's damaged, and by, same thing, it needs to be removed. If there's that branch that's poking you in the eye as you walk down the sidewalk, or hit you in the head as you're walking, that can be taken off any time of the year. The other exceptions, a lot of gardeners like to go out and do some clippings of some of their evergreens and shrubs to put in decorations for the holidays coming up here in December. And that's fine to go ahead and get a few nips and tucks here and there. But that overall, where we're going to be removing maybe more than 5-10% of the total growth, probably needs to wait till we're in that fully dormant period or to the following late winter period.
Well, let's do then, Dennis, think a bit ahead to that dormant period whenever that finally settles in. And you mentioned an important benchmark there. One, even at that point in time, doesn't want to prune back further than a certain percentage of the growth of a plant, correct?
Well, let's separate out trees versus shrubs. On trees, we want to make sure we're probably never removing around 30% of the total wood or growth on that tree. What happens if we over prune a tree, it can stimulate a lot of growth, and we get what we call that secondary sucker growth, water sprouts, those type of things that are not always the best structured branches in our trees. Even with fruit trees, same thing can happen. So we try to keep that balance. The other thing is a lot of young trees, we want to keep 2/3 crown, 1/3 trunk. We don't want to really limb that trunk up really fast, really high, because we need all that foliage to create more energy for that tree to grow. Now, shrubs, that's completely different. Shrubs, you can throw the rule out the window because large overgrown shrubs like an old lilac, forsythia, you can do what we call rejuvenation pruning, and that's really removing 100% of all the growth pretty much back to the ground, and we're starting over. So we can get pretty ruthless with our shrubs.
In those cases, though, it's really hard for a homeowner to take that quantum leap, if you will. But those plants are well entrenched enough at that point, they can come back fully the next growing season, right?
That's correct. When you're rejuvenating an old shrub, oh my gosh, probably by June, July, it's back to several feet tall or more, just because it had all that energy in that root system. It was putting in that top growth, so it has to send it somewhere. The other thing I've learned about individuals and pruning is a lot of people are fearful to prune, so they wait, and then it gets to the point, well, oh my gosh, I have no options to prune. And then at that point in time, you have to make more severe cuts, more drastic cuts, which are slower to heal over. So my advice to people is just do it. Don't wait, because procrastination just makes it harder on the plant, harder on you than just going ahead and making those cuts while they're still young. And the smaller the branch, the quicker they're going to heal over, seal over, and life's going to move on just fine.
We'll finish with this. This applies to any time one is correctively pruning a tree or a shrub. Technique is everything. If you do choose to trim back to maybe a modest degree an ornamental here in the fall yet, you need to make sure it's a clean cut, right?
That's correct. We'd recommend, right tool for the job. So if it's, kind of pinky size or so, you can use a pair of hand clippers. If it's probably thumb size or so, use a pair of loppers. If it's probably much over that inch or so, that's when you want to be the pruning saw out. And the recommendation on a tree is to prune just to the outside of the branch collar. And that's where there'd be a little ridge, raised area around where that branch is connected to the side branch. And so you just want to take your pruning cut ever so slightly to the outside of that little raised ring, because that's cambium tissue that's going to fill in, grow in, and keep that tree as healthy as possible and cover that wound up so rot and decay does not set in.
And in the case of a shrub, the hedge trimmer is a bit more aggressive, but use it judiciously as well.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of pruning for the natural look, kind of how nature intended the plant to look. So that's really not using the head shears, using the clippers the loppers and making individual cuts, which takes longer, but you get better flowering, more beauty out of the shrub for the long term.
All right. Main message again, though, is even though you might be tempted to aggressively prune your ornamentals at this time of the year, step back and reassess that, because it may well be a project you'll want to hold off on until that plant is fully dormant and maybe even considerably further beyond that. Good input, Dennis. As always, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Eric.
Dennis Patton, horticultural agent with the Johnson County Extension Office, and with us regularly for our horticulture segment right here. Our time's away for today. Thanks for listening. Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.